Hello. This workshop is the ankle, the biomechanical marble. My name is Laura Abbott, and I am an instructor at Georgia State University in the Exercise Science Department. And I have some other qualifications here, and I'll let you kind of read over those if you want to, just so that you can put a little background with the person who's talking to you, and also put a face with the voice. This particular slide will be shown at the end of your workshop as well, so don't feel like you need to jot this down if you haven't printed out your PowerPoints. But once you complete the webinar, you are able to get your certificate of completion immediately following. And what you'll do is you'll log on to the exerciseetc.com website, and you'll follow the instructions. Like I said, this slide is available at the end of this workshop as well. But I really wanted to present this to you because of this last little bullet point right down here. I don't know how the WebEx program does this, but it does. It will record whether you log off during this presentation, if you log off early or fast forward through the presentation. And if you do that, that's not good because you may not get your continuing education credits because you didn't listen for the whole 2 hours. Now, I hope to make this exciting for you and give you some really good information so you won't even want to do that. But just be aware of that. Also to note that you need to complete this webinar and print the certificate by December 31st of the same year that you purchased it. Certificates with next year's date may not be accepted by your credentialing organization, so be aware of that as well. And just to kind of go through some of the objectives for this workshop, what we hope for you to get out of this is we're going to do a little review of the anatomy and kinesiology of the foot and the ankle. We also hope that you will understand the most common ankle injuries and dysfunctions, and use or how you can use mobility and strength training to maintain that function and restore mobility and function after an injury, and then also learn to set the stage for activity-specific training. So the ankle, we've always focused on the knee as far as injuries and problems and, other issues that may be going on mechanically that may be affected because of the knee. And we're realizing more and more that the ankle really may be kind of a big issue with that as far as movement issues and proper mechanics and why people may continue to get injured over and over again, which kind of makes sense if you think about it because the ankle and the foot is the foundation of our body. So it is under new scrutiny as far as research goes. Our feet and the ankle act as shock absorbers and can mold and adapt when faced even on uneven terrain. So if your ankle's not able to move properly on uneven terrain, that can affect your mechanics further up the body. So injuries to the foot and the ankle affect 40% of the population at least one point in their life. We've all rolled our ankle. We've all maybe had a little Achilles tendonitis or, something going on, and that can affect our mechanics. The incidence of foot and ankle injuries is even higher for runners, which, that makes sense. Approximately 60% of runners will have at least one injury every 2 years. And then foot and ankle injuries often lead to issues higher up the kinetic chain, like we were just talking about. It is our foundation. It's our base of support. So if your ankles don't move properly for whatever reason, then that is going to affect the mechanics of your knees, your hip, your back. And when all of those are affected, it just continues on up the chain to the shoulders and even up to the neck. So let's review a little bit about the foot. I was in a podiatrist office one day, and you're waiting for your doctor to come in, and you're looking around the room and looking at all the posters that may be in there. And this one poster really caught my eye. And it was one of those things that I just never really thought about. I teach anatomy, but I just never really thought about this point. And the point was that most of your bones, at least a quarter of your bones, are in one foot. And I thought, wow, that's true. There's 206 bones in the foot, and the foot has 26 of those bones. So that's just a smidge over a quarter of all of your bones. So 50% of our bones are in both feet. And of course, we're not talking about the hands, but I thought it was kind of interesting that the hands make up another fourth, each hand. So, you're looking at a lot of bones in these ankles and in your feet, and it's not surprising then when you think about that if anything goes wrong with one of those bones or one of those ligaments, then it's going to cause problems. So your foot actually has 33 joints in it. So that's a lot of ligaments also that are in there. And we don't necessarily think of our feet that way, but each of your tarsal bones, each of your metatarsals, each of your phalanges, all 14 of your phalanges, your 5 metatarsals, they all have joints, because a joint is where two bones come together. So you're looking at this picture and it's like, wow, there really are a lot of joints in here. You've also, with your muscles, your dorsal muscle is the extensor digitorum brevis. Your plantar muscles include 4 layers of intrinsic muscles that both stabilize and move the joints of the feet. So bottom line is we got a heck of a lot going on with our feet. And it's funny when you think about it that we haven't been focusing on the feet as much when it comes to mechanics and movement issues. So yay that we finally have done that. So when you're looking at the soft tissues of the ankle, you've got your ligaments. You have a lot of ligaments in there. Anterior and posterior talofibular ligaments. And what I love about ligaments is they're typically named after the 2 bones that they attach. So your talus and your fibula, they've got an anterior connection and a posterior connection to help stabilize that ankle. You have your calcaneofibular ligament. Then as far as your muscles go, and you guys are familiar with these muscles, I'm sure, gastrocnemius and soleus, which attaches down at the calcaneal bone on the posterior side. You got your perineals, which, just as an FYI, a lot of anatomists are switching over to calling the perineals the fibularis muscles. So you may read in books and you may see that term used instead. So these are your lateral muscles. And then you've got your anterior and your posterior tibialis. So, and then of course, deeper, which we don't really focus on too much in this workshop, but you've got all your digitorum muscles that go to your toes that allow you to do things that also cross over these joints. You've got your extensors and your flexors of those toe muscles and your ankle muscles. You've got the hallucis muscles. The hallux is the fancy term for the big toe. And you've got your extensors and your flexors and your abductors and your adductors and, muscles in between all those metatarsals. And, so you got a lot going on besides just what's on this slide. And then, of course, your true ankle joint is going to be the talus joint and the subtalus joint, where the tibia and the fibula come down and kind of hover over that talus bone. So your common injuries and dysfunctions of the ankle: reduced ankle range of motion for a variety of different reasons, plantar fasciitis, ankle sprains, your high ankle sprains, we're going to talk about each of these, Achilles tendonitis, and overpronation. So let's talk about reduced ankle range of motion. So limits in ankle dorsiflexion, and just to remind you, dorsiflexion is when you are kind of walking on your heels, you're lifting your toes up, you're decreasing that angle between the lower leg and the top of the foot. And it can lead to a whole bunch of problems. And ironically, I don't know if this is why they wanted me to teach this webinar for you, but I'm dealing with an issue right now for myself. And I realize when I've run a lot, I've had to take some time off from running because I'm getting patellar tendonitis. And, so I'm looking at the knee, and I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, limited range of motion of my ankle on that same leg, and some other issues that are going on that are muscular weakness issues. But the biggie is my ankle's very limited in range of motion and has been for I don't know how long, but because as an athlete, I was a swimmer, it wasn't that big of a deal. But now that I've switched to running and have switched to running for years, it's becoming a problem, but never figured it out until I really took a good look at my ankle range of motion. So limited range of motion, you can't send appropriate information up to the central nervous system, up the spinal cord and to the brain to let your body know and your brain send information as to what's going on as far as planting your foot properly. I don't know if any of you have ever done this before, but if you ever go running early in the morning or go walking early in the morning outside, or you're on the treadmill at the gym and you hear somebody slapping their feet down, they're like what I call heavy-footed runners. It may be because they aren't getting good range of motion in their ankle joint and they're hitting the ground more flat-footed. And that's just going to send all kinds of shock waves up your knee, up your hip, up into your back. And so sometimes these individuals who are having these problems in these other areas of their lower body especially, it may be because they don't have that range of motion where they can't dorsiflex the foot properly. So they're not landing heel versus midfoot, whatever works for that person. They can't toe off properly because they don't have that proper range of motion in their foot. So other areas of the body are having to take up the stress of the shock absorption. Also, too, the second point here, it results in knee valgus during functional movements. Your ankle can't dorsiflex. So when you plant your foot, you have to compensate elsewhere in the body in order to get the movement that you need. So the knees start to compensate, and the knees start to compensate because you can't dorsiflex the foot as you're starting to roll, whether you're walking or running, starting to roll into the toe-off phase. So in order to get the movement at the hip joint, the knee caves in. So now you've got some valgus issues going on. Well, let's think about this for a second. You have somebody who already has knee valgus issues. That knock knee is what we're talking about. Mainly your women. So if they already have these issues because of other things going on, bone structure, whatever, this is going to make it worse. So correcting the ankle may help correct some of the valgus of that knee. And it kind of goes back to which came first, the chicken or the egg. Do they have valgus because their vastus medialis is weak? Do they have valgus because the ankle's lacking range of motion, causing them to be more knock-kneed or valgus, thus leading to a weaker vastus medialis? Who knows? But that's something to consider when you're looking at your client. So without dorsiflexion, this third bullet point, hip extension doesn't occur properly during walking. Well, let's think about that for a second. Hip extension doesn't occur properly. Gluteus maximus, a little bit of the hamstrings. So what happens here is that your quads start to take over in order to help you get your correct walking gait, which means now the glutes become weaker and weaker, which leads to more problems. So again, it's fascinating that we haven't really looked at the ankle as much as we should have. We've known for years that a lot of knee problems can be because of weak glutes, but we never really thought about weak glutes being caused by lack of ankle range of motion. So it's just opening up this whole new window of possibilities to help your client. That, you've got those clients that you get frustrated, not at the client, but because their injury isn't getting better. And it's like, what am I missing here? We're doing the glute exercises, we're doing the stretches, we're doing this, we're doing that, and it's maybe the ankle. So when you can't, like I said, when you can't dorsiflex the foot, the hip extension doesn't occur properly. It increases knee flexion during walking. And of course, that places more stress on the knee. So then you start getting things like patellar tendonitis, jumper's knee, runner's knee, all these different knee issues. A little bit of increased risk of chondromalacia, which kind of goes back to this knee valgus issue. It's amazing that sometimes what we think is step number one may be step number two, and what we're missing is step number one, which may be the ankle. So, plantar fasciitis. The plantar fascia, it's a system of connective tissue that runs from the heel of your foot to just behind your toes. So during weight-bearing activities such as walking or running, your body weight is transferred onto your foot from your heel to your toes. And we typically should heel strike, roll a little bit to the lateral edge of the foot, and then off the big toe. We should be toeing off the big toe, which is one of the reasons why it's the big toe. So when your weight is transferred onto your foot to your heel, this results in your toes moving away from the heel. This spreading out of the foot places tension on the plantar fascia because it connects these two parts. So if the tension on the structure is too great or it's not dispersed evenly, the plantar fascia can develop little micro tears and become irritated and painful, which results in this condition called plantar fasciitis. Now, the challenge once you get plantar fasciitis is it really takes a long time for it to go away because the fascia doesn't get a whole lot of blood supply. And without that blood supply, you're not getting oxygen and nutrients to that side or to that location. So it can take a long time for it to heal up, and that sometimes gets people frustrated, and they don't always do what they're supposed to do to make sure that the healing process is fully taking place. So one of the other issues is overpronation. Leads to forces moving across the foot, going from medial to lateral instead of heel to toe. And so that can create issues. Restriction of the foot and ankle lead to increased stretching of the plantar fascia. So when the fascia starts to feel too much stress and it starts to lengthen too much, the weaker end of the fascia is this end right here underneath the heel. And the weaker end of any muscle, tendon, or connective tissue is going to be the place where you start to get the injuries and the micro tears. So that's why a lot of people complain of heel pain when they're starting to develop plantar fasciitis. It's tearing right there at the base of the calcaneus, and that can lead to bigger problems if it isn't treated properly. How to reduce overpronation? Look at their gait. Improve closed chain dorsiflexion and hip flexion. So again, it goes back to the ankle. What's going on at the ankle? And that's where we need to be careful also, just as a little sidebar item here, of taking the latest, greatest research that comes out and applying it to all of your clients when maybe it's not appropriate for all of your clients. And what I'm talking about here is this midfoot running. If you have a client who's been running for years and has not had problems with plantar fasciitis, and then you turn around and say, hey, there's this new article that's come out or this new research that's come out that's saying midfoot running is actually better. Well, maybe, maybe not. You start changing that stride in your client and the heel strike in your client when their body has adapted to the forces that the heel strike for them, and it's worked well for them. Why change it? Because when you change it, it might start leading to injury problems. And it may not be a good way for them to strike their foot on the ground, depending on their range of motion and their structure. So we have to be careful when we see research and think, oh, I need to change everything because of this research. Um, Sometimes research is published and it's great information, but that information doesn't necessarily mean you need to change everything. And it may not apply to your client because of the population they tested. And it may be a study that, yes, it's been published, but hasn't been repeated with the same results. So you need to take some of the research to heart if you aren't already. So let's look at ankle sprains. Oh, Lord, we've all probably had an ankle sprain. Your ankle sprains, you've got your lateral ankle sprain, which is really the more common one. Probably 95% of your ankle sprains are lateral. Medial ankle sprains, and then your syndesmotic or high ankle sprain. So when you look at your lateral ankle sprain, more often occurs in women. Hormones play a role in that, doggone it. Structure of the joint. Sometimes women's joints have a little bit more flexibility to them than men do. And that just kind of goes back to the fact that men tend to have denser, stronger muscles, and we have a lot of tendons that come around down to the lateral side behind the lateral malleolus and attach elsewhere on the foot. And women tend to have a little bit more laxity than men do in this area. And again, it kind of goes back to hormones. But the other reason why lateral ankle sprains are more common, 85%, I said 95 earlier, 85 to 95%, is the structure of the ankle. So when you are looking at the talus bone, that is one of your metatarsals, it sits right underneath the tibia and the fibula. When you plant or flex or point your toes, you lose stability of the joint, mainly because the talus is kind of pulling out from underneath the tibia and the fibula. And so what you're relying on to help stabilize is your ligaments and your tendons that are around that ankle joint. The lateral side of the ankle is more so the tendons that it's holding on for stability. The medial side of the ankle has a big old strong ligament called the deltoid ligament. And as we know, ligaments are much better at stabilizing joints than tendons. Tendons are meant to be elastic because they connect muscle to bone. And you need the muscle to move, so you need the tendon to move. But ligaments they're there for stability. So the medial side of the ankle has this big old strong deltoid ligament. So to medially roll the ankle is a bit more challenging, or evert is another term for that. Your lateral ankle sprains or your inversion ankle sprains, not as strong on the lateral side. Plus, again, most of our ankle sprains occur when we plantar flex and then invert. So again, you lose that stability of the talus bone being directly underneath the tibia and the fibula when the foot is plantar flexed. It's not underneath there anymore. So you lose a nice, strong bone structure stability there as well. So 70% of your ankle sprains have recurrent symptoms. Excuse me. Well, you just stretch something, and it may be a first-degree sprain of a ligament, which means for the most part that the ligament's still intact, but it's been stretched. And I kind of relate that to that rubber band that's been used for decades, and it used to be maybe, at rest with no tension, it used to be maybe 3 inches long, and now it's been used so much it's stretched but not torn, and now it's 5 inches long. Well, our ligaments do the same thing. And when we hear the word sprain, remember we're talking about ligaments, not the tendons. The tendons are going to be a strain with a T. And yes, you can still strain those tendons in there as well. And that is also a very common reason why people keep rolling their ankle, so to speak. So you may have a first-degree ankle sprain. Once those ligaments are stretched, they don't go back to their resting length again. So you got to strengthen the muscles around that ankle joint. And that's not really something most people focus on when they're in the gym. So they keep having these problems. We'll talk about shoes later on as well, and proper shoes, but that can also play a role if you're not wearing the right shoes. So the anterior tibiofibular ligament, which connects the talus to the fibula on the lateral side or the outside of the ankle. You've got that one there, and you've got this really good picture here showing your ligaments. The calcaneal fibular ligament, which connects the fibula to the calcaneus below it. And then there's a third ligament, which is not commonly torn. It runs more in the back of the ankle, and it's called the posterior talofibular ligament. So again, just to kind of review, remembering that you've got your first, second, and third degree sprains. And like we mentioned, your first degree is a stretched ligament. There's no tearing. There's minor disruption of the tissue, but the problem is the ligament is stretched, and it's probably not going to go back to its resting length ever again. So you got to really strengthen the muscles around that joint. A second degree is a minor tear in the ligament, and typically, if there is a second degree tear anywhere in the body, but we're talking ankles right now, doctors won't do surgery on it. They hope that it will heal itself, which means those little fibers will kind of come back together and heal back up. But again, the problem is even in that situation, the ligament is still stretched, even though it's healed up. And like we said, it's just not going to go back to its normal resting condition again. It's been damaged. There is a 2+ tear, and that's where the ligament is pretty much almost completely torn, but it's still connected a little bit. So that's why it's still a second degree tear, but they add the plus because it's almost what we call a third degree tear, which is a complete tear. And that's where doctors need to go in and surgically repair that, because they got to reconnect things because it won't on its own. Now, your high ankle sprains, and this is where we have to be careful when people wear ankle braces and tape their ankles all the time, because now you're creating such a nice stability in the ankle joint itself that if there is a mechanical challenge to the ankle joint, where normally the ankle would give at the ankle joint, you've got this brace preventing that. So the force that has been exerted on the ankle for whatever reason goes up higher. So you may be kind of pushing your problem further up the ankle. And what happens here is you have a dorsiflexion, forced external rotation of the tibia, and now you damage the tibia, or actually the fibula. So the sprain is to the syndesmotic ligaments that connect the tibia and the fibula. So let me change colors here. Let's go with the blue. So this area, you've got this connective tissue that's between the tibia and the fibula, very similar to what goes on between the radius and the ulna. They kind of help keep the bones aligned with each other. And you start tearing that instead. And that's got some good blood supply in it. So limiting weight-bearing exercises may be necessary, especially if you fracture the the fibula in process. The nice thing about the fibula is it's not really a big, heavy weight-bearing bone. It only bears maybe about 10% of our body weight. So you can fracture that and still be able to walk, even though you know that you feel some pain and you know something's going on, and it can pretty much heal itself. If you fracture the tibia, you can't walk on it. It's 90% weight bearing. So the challenge here and the food for thought here, the takeaway information is ankle braces really should not be worn as a prevention. Lots of different reasons there. This is one of them. And the other reason is that if you're constantly depending on an ankle brace, then your muscles don't have to do any work, so they start to get weaker and weaker. So a temporary use of an ankle brace may be needed, but eventually the person needs to strengthen those muscles, and they need to try to get away from that ankle brace. Interesting, though, that if you are an athletic trainer listening to this, or you've played in sports such as basketball and football, where sometimes the team automatically gets their ankles taped. This can be a concern. Now, tape gives a little bit better than a hard brace, so it's less likely that it might happen with ankle taping, but it is a concern to consider. So strengthening those muscles is just always the better way to go, and wearing proper shoes and other things that we're going to talk about. So now looking at Achilles tendonitis, overuse or degeneration of the Achilles tendon, and remembering that the Achilles tendon is where the gastrocnemius and the soleus merge together in order to attach down here to the calcaneus. And, if you're not familiar with it, if you feel on the posterior side of your calcaneal bone, your heel bone, you'll feel a little bump back there. And that little bump is right where your Achilles tendon inserts. Typically, the tendonitis occurs about an inch above that. So a lot of times when people have Achilles tendonitis, one of their first complaints is, I can't wear shoes. I have to wear flip-flops slip-on shoes because the back of my tennis shoes hits right where my ankle hurts on the Achilles. And that's about an inch above the insertion. So that's a sign that they're getting some Achilles tendonitis. Dramatic increase in training or impact activities can lead to Achilles tendonitis, doing too much too fast. Compensation from normal gait patterns can also lead to it. Again, this kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about limited ankle range of motion. So something's got to pick up the slack, and that's going to be Achilles tendon. And then your treatment involves rest of that ankle or foot, improving the mobility of the ankle and foot, and incorporating some stability exercises. And we're going to talk about a lot of this stuff as we go through the program here. And then overpronation of the foot. This leads to ankle dysfunction. It leads to problems further up that kinetic chain because, again, like we've been saying, your feet are the foundation of all of your movement when you're doing weight-bearing type activities. So what you're looking for here is a collapsing arch and internally rotating tibia and femur. So this kind of goes into the valgus, and again, we're all connected. So when your arch rolls inward or you've got a flat arch, and I've seen people, and you probably have too, they hold their foot up, their arch looks great, they stand on that foot, and the arch collapses. So looking at them weight bearing is very important. Of course, one foot may be more pronated than the other. Look at the wear and tear of their shoes. On the sole of the shoe, you can see what their pattern is of movement. So asking them to bring a well-used pair of shoes in is always very helpful. You see people walking around. I'm in Atlanta, and Georgia State University is downtown. So you can just sit on the front steps of a building and watch people walk by and just analyze. And you're thinking, wow, I wonder if that person has knee and hip problems because look at their shoes. Look how their ankles roll in so far that it almost looks like they're walking on the medial side of their foot. And their shoes start to shift that way. You look at tennis shoes that when you look at the opening of your tennis shoes where your foot goes in and the medial side is just so stretched and rounded, and that is a sign that that person's probably pronating. So it does tend to pull the feet in. It does tend to pull the tibia and the femur in, so they become more valgus. And along with ankle and foot pain, there's a loss of proper knee alignment. These are the people who tend to run like a girl, meaning that their knees go in, their feet go out, which means their elbows go out, and they kick people or hit people with their elbows. And because women tend to have more of a tendency towards valgus of the knees for lots of different reasons, but we just mentioned earlier on a previous slide that women also tend to have a little bit more ankle issues because of hormones and structure of the body. So, gee, could it be that we've always focused on the knees and the vastus medialis for valgus when we need to be looking at that ankle? So look at the wear and tear pattern of the shoes. Look at your person just walking. Make sure, this is where it's so important that they have the right type of shoes. Again, we're going to talk about that later on. But, you know, nowadays you can't just go in and buy a pair of running shoes or workout shoes. There are shoes for that provide stability. There are shoes for the overpronator. There's shoes for the oversupinator. There's shoes for more medial lateral stability, such as running shoes. There are shoes for more flexibility medial and laterally because of types of activities that they're playing or sports. You know, it's confusing sometimes. So it's always good to find a place that does some type of analysis with qualified people in the shoe store, and you usually find these in running stores and you know, places that kind of cater to that population where they have well-trained people who can let you know, hey, this is what's going on with your foot, and this is the type of shoe that you need to be getting. So, well, here's the segue to that. So I kind of hit on this a little bit, but oh my goodness, look at these heels. Kudos to her for being able to wear those. I would not be able to. But lately, we've been hearing a lot about flip-flops, and they're not the greatest things to wear. Of course, in the summertime, it's the go-to, but you know, lots of things to kind of keep in mind. There's some really good research articles that you guys might be interested in getting and reading, just downloading and reading. And one of them is by Thompson and Conklin, Coughlin. And the name of their article is The High Price of High Fashion Footwear. This is in the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery from 2008. There's another article by Frey, F-R-E-Y, and Roberts, and it is titled Problem Shoes, Problem Feet, What to Tell Women About Footwear Recommendations on Diagnosis, Treatment, and Prevention. And this was in Women's Health and Primary Care back in 2002. So we've been looking at these shoe problems for a long, long time. So we know the high-heeled shoe problem, that it puts a lot of pressure on the forefoot and the toes, the bunions. Well, bunions can, based on the shape of the toe box of the shoe. And we also know that high-heeled shoes also shorten the calf muscles, the gastrocnemius and the soleus, which can lead to limited range of motion, which goes back to all this other stuff we were talking about earlier. So that is one thing to keep in mind. And we're not saying don't ever wear these. We're saying make sure you do appropriate things such as stretch and strengthen so that you don't have these problems if you're wearing these shoes. Sandals and flip-flops. Clenching or flexing the toes to prevent the sandals from falling off leads to stiffening of those toes. And I mentioned briefly earlier that we have all of our little digitorum muscles, our flexor and extensor digitorum muscles. So whenever we clench our toes, we are tightening up the flexor and the hallucis digitorum muscles because those are all the muscles that run along the bottom of your foot and tend to come up the posterior side of the lower leg for the most part. So that can lead to a lot of tightness and issues. And then over-supported shoes. You know, sometimes people think, oh, you can't go wrong if you have too much support. Well, you kind of can. It prevents our feet from getting the sensory information that allows us to respond to different stimuli, such as change in surface. So that can mean that your Golgi tendons and your muscle spindles, which, you know, if you remember, your muscle spindles help your muscles from overstretching by creating an involuntary contraction. So as your feet are wobbling, as you're going over uneven terrain, your muscle spindles help to contract muscles to prevent them, in this case, such as your ankle, from rolling over too far. On the lateral side, your Golgi tendons, which prevent your muscles from overstretching, overcontracting by creating an involuntary relaxation, they're going to be hitting the opposite muscles so that one side can relax, so one side can tighten, so you don't roll your ankle. And if you don't have this sensory information being fed back up to the brain so that your brain can tell your muscles what they need to do, you end up rolling your ankle. And, you know, that was something years and years ago where you had shoes that, well, the little roller shoes, the shoes that had the, oh, I wish I could remember the name of them, but they had the heel that was so thick, but it was curved so that you rolled as you walked. And I remember trying a pair of those on just out of curiosity, and my first thought was, oh my gosh, the heel or the sole of the shoe is so thick that you can't tell when you're getting ready to roll your ankle. And that was one of the complaints that people had about it. Yes, they were cushiony and soft, but I kept rolling my ankle in them. Well, it was because they were too cushiony and soft for you, and your brain didn't know what was going on because it couldn't feel anything on the surface, and it couldn't signal those Golgi tendons and muscle spindles to do their job when you started losing stability. So it goes back to that happy medium when it comes to the body. Some is good, more is not necessarily better, and too little's not good either. So we got to find that happy medium by wearing proper shoes. And then the pros and cons of barefoot versus barefoot shoes. I always tell people, you know, one of the marketing, and I personally haven't heard a lot about these barefoot shoes very much over the past few years. I kind of wonder if they've kind of run their course, no pun intended there. But people had told me, but the marketing says, you know, that people were barefoot back in caveman era. And I'm like, that's the marketing trying to convince you to buy this, because I challenge any of these marketing companies and these shoe companies to provide research from the caveman era that says this is why we don't wear shoes, that we don't have any problems with our feet and our ankles and our knees and this, that, and the other thing. And because somebody in the course of the history of man created shoes for a reason, created sandals and created shoes for a reason. So while some people say these are the best, greatest things to walk and run and this, that, and the other thing, they're not great for everyone, because not everybody's foot's structured the same. And that was where I kind of got frustrated also with some of the marketing, is that it's great for everyone. Well, is anything great for everyone? Probably not. So we've got to take into account our clients and what their activity is and what else is going on with their body. So again, it goes back to understanding the mechanisms behind common foot and ankle injuries or dysfunctions. It doesn't matter how good your shoe is. If you don't have good range of motion of your ankle, you're still going to have problems. So assess the posture and the movement of the foot and the ankle. Enhance mobility of the big toe and the ankle. Why the big toe? Well, remember earlier we said that that is what you are toeing off of. So that big toe has to have good dorsiflexion, and or I guess I should say toe extension, as the ankle dorsiflexes so you can properly toe off of it. Enhance stability of the midfoot and the knee. Kind of goes back to what joints need to be mobile and what joints need to be stable. Well, the toes need to be mobile, the midfoot needs to be stable, the ankle needs to be mobile, the knee needs to be stable. So it's when we start having biomechanical dysfunctions that areas of the body that should be for stability have to become mobilized in order for the body to work the way that it needs to work, which creates problems, because it shouldn't be a stability joint. It should be, it shouldn't be a mobility joint. It should be a stability joint. So when you're forcing a stability joint to become a mobility joint, now you're going to have some problems. And then we need to teach proper loading, shock absorption, gait mechanics with integrated exercises. And this is one of the challenges that I find, even with my students as they're learning, is we tend to focus initially as we're learning exercises on the joint of that relate to the muscles that are being moved, but they're not looking at the whole body. And it's like, you've got to look at the whole body. You know, it kind of goes back to, and we'll talk about this actually in a little bit, squats. It is a great exercise, but it's not a great exercise if the person can't do it properly. And if the person can't do it properly, they're not using proper form, we need to take a look at what's going on. It may not be that they lack core. It may not be that their quad muscles are weak and we need to modify the exercise. It could be something that's going on at the joints, that the joints for some reason are not able to move the way that they're supposed to move, so other areas of the body are having to compensate. And it goes back to, let's start with the ankle, which is why we have this presentation going on. So, looking at your arches, postural analysis, or any type of movement assessment, whether it's the FMS or what other type of assessments there are out there, and there are lots of them out there, and they're all great. But the point is we've got to look at our clients, see what's going on. So have clients stand with their shoes and socks off and just observe the arch to see if the feet are flattened. One of the things that I also include, and it's not mentioned on the slide, but it's showing you in the picture, what is the Achilles tendon doing? Neutral is what you're looking for. The Achilles tendon is aligned, which probably means that they have a nice medial arch. Now, remember, you've got three main arches in your foot. You've got the medial arch, which is what most people think of as the arch of the foot. But you also have a lateral, and I should say lateral longitudinal arch on the lateral side of the foot, which is not as prominent. And then across the top of the foot, your metatarsals have a transverse arch. And for someone who has low longitudinal medial arch, meaning that main arch that we think of is flat, that also means the transverse arch going across the top of the foot may also be flattened. Now, way back at the beginning of this lecture, we talked about all those joints that are in the foot, and all those joints are connected with ligaments. So now you've got a flat foot, or it's called pes planus, P-E-S, and then a separate word, P-L-A-N-U-S. That means now that all of those ligaments are on undue strain, and all of those bones that should be in an arch formation and are now flattened. So that's going to lead to the muscles that attach to those locations on those bones are also stretched or affected somehow, which means those muscles where they attach, which is in the lower leg, on the anterior, the posterior, medial lateral side, because they're toe muscles, are now going to be affected. So sometimes we look at gastrocnemius and soleus or tibialis anterior, because those are the bigger, larger muscles in the lower leg, when we also need to think about at least those deeper, smaller muscles, because we got a lot of them, that also affect the toes, also affect the metatarsals, also affect all those little bones, those tarsal bones in the foot, because those cross that joint. And if those are affected because these arches are affected, those need to be investigated for strengthening or stretching as well. So that's where you might have your client do some strengthening exercises by picking up marbles off the floor, or whatever little objects to help work on the digitorum and the hallucis flexor muscles, but also having them do some stretching of the extensor muscles. We forget to stretch the toes. We think about the ankle, but we forget about strengthening and stretching the toes. But all of that's going to be affected because it's all in the same area. So I rambled. That's what I do. So you want to observe the arch, see if the feet are flattened. Pes planus, which is just a flat-footed, here's my little toe, because remember that fascia that's on the bottom of your foot can also get affected. And it starts to, whoops, oh, there we go. It starts to pull from that heel, and it starts to pull away from the center of your foot, which can also lead to plantar fasciitis. So the fascia can either be affected because you've got a high arch, which is pes, oop, that was a really bad start to the drawing here. And I'm really drawing with a computer mouse, so it's not very pretty anyway. So pes cavus, which is where the arch is too high, and the opening, it looks like the opening to a cave, so we call it pes cavus. That can start to pull the fascia towards the center of the foot. And that fascia, again, the weaker side, or the weaker attachment of the fascia is at the heel of the foot, so it's going to start to, cause the heel pain that you get with typical plantar fasciitis. With pes planus over here on the left, the picture on the left, is it's still pulling, it's just pulling away because now the fascia is being stretched too far. And again, it's going to start affecting at the heel, mainly because that's the weaker end. But this is also in pes planus, the flat-footed also starts to cause arch pain because it's just pulling away from the center. So the last bullet point here also asks the client to move to pronate or collapse and supinate the arch to see if they have mobility. So ask them to flatten the arch, ask them to raise the arch to see if they have some good ankle mobility in there, because that may tell you, hey, you got a great arch, but you still don't have good mobility in your foot. So this is something you guys have probably seen, and it's a great way to assess for ankle dorsiflexion because people typically lack in this. So you're going to start in a half kneeling position, just like this guy is in the picture. And you're going to have your toes about 5 inches away from the wall. You're going to drive the knee forward into a dorsiflexion position. And you should be able to touch your knee to the wall without internally rotating the femur. If you are unable to do this, or your client is unable to do this, then you may be lacking in range of motion for dorsiflexion. And that could be causing this other host of problems that we were talking about further up the chain, where you're not able to plant your foot properly as you walk or run. And that starts to place more stress on the quads and place more stress on the knee, because now you're having to modify how you're swinging your foot through when you have your walking gait or your running gait, which now means that transition or compensation is leading to less work on the glutes, and now your glutes are getting weak. That whole chain. So this is a great assessment to check for, just simple and easy, and of course do both feet. And if you want to get technical with it, you can get a goniometer and measure knee angle so that you can compare one leg to the other. Sometimes visually you might miss small little changes, but those are differences, and those small little differences might help indicate why one side is having more problems than the other between your left and your right side. The ankle plantar flexion. This could be an issue for some individuals as well. They lack range of motion in plantar flexion. So we're looking for about 30 to 50 degrees of plantar flexion. So you can have your client sit like they are in this picture to the left. And again, this is where your goniometers come into play. And goniometers, they're just little plastic devices that measure range of motion. And they're really inexpensive. You can just Google it and get one for, a couple of bucks actually. And then the standing test for the picture on the right, a simple measure is that they can raise their heels with both legs or with one leg under good control, so they have good stability. So if you see people walking, and we see people walking in high heel shoes, especially little kids as they play with mom's high heel shoes, and the ankles are wobbling, that may be a sign of some compensation and weakness that's going on. Testing for inversion and eversion. You're going to have your client sit just like this person is in the picture. Again, shoes are off. And see if they can get the inside and the outside of their foot off the ground without moving their knees. So what you can do here is have them place their hands, yeah, I teach anatomy, right? Have their hands knuckled between their knees, just like in the picture here, so that they cannot move their knees as you check for eversion and inversion range of motion. So just little screening tools that you can do. The lateral step down test, requires adequate foot and ankle stability, and as well as core stability and lower body strength. And what you're looking for here is as you you start at the top, so you have this one leg on the top, and you have, they added some tape stripes on here so they could check for knee alignment and hip alignment, which you can already tell this person's not very well aligned. And what you're doing is you're just dropping the heel of the upper leg down to the floor. What you're checking for is inadequate ankle dorsiflexion can lead to that valgus movement that we were talking about. So again, if you've got somebody who is scoring low, and let me go back to this one, if they're scoring low here on the ankle dorsiflexion test, you know, because again, excuse me, we're looking to make sure that the knee is touching the wall without internally or rotating the femur. If you're suspecting it, have your person do this test so that you can actually see it. If your person doesn't have good core stability or lower body strength, don't do this test and only do this one to see if it works. And let's say you've got a client who can't get down on their knee like this. Well, what you may want to do then is just have them sit on the floor or in a chair and just straighten one leg and have them dorsiflex their foot. This is where the goniometer can come into play and let you know if they have good dorsiflexion range of motion. Because I know, you know, some of you guys are working with clients that can't do some of these things as far as the positioning because of other limitations. And then the cross lunge. During gait, when the foot makes contact with the floor, it should be absorbing force by going into pronation, although you're not overpronating. And when the body moves past the foot, it loads into supination and propels the body forward. So when a person lacks dorsiflexion or overpronates, you'll notice they turn their feet out when they walk to make up for this lack of mobility. Now, we in the South call that slew-footed. And it's really interesting when you see people walking, again, watching people in downtown Atlanta, that they walk with their feet out to the side. Their toes are pointed outward, and it's almost like they're moving and walking more on the medial side of their foot. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. And sometimes people think, oh, that's a hip issue. It might be a foot issue. So if they're really lacking in dorsiflexion, they're going to walk with their feet turned out to the side. So it's not always what we thought of as a piriformis issue. In the hip, it could be ankle dorsiflexion issues. So, of course, that's going to lead to faulty movement patterns up the kinetic chain. It can start to create plantar fasciitis. It can start to create bunions because now instead of toeing off on the big toe in the, distal type part of the toe, the distal phalange of the toe, now you're toeing off on the side of the big toe. And so that can start to cause that big toe to angle in laterally. It starts to shift laterally, and it creates that big old bunion at the metatarsal head. So some of your people may have bunions because of lack of ankle range of motion. So interesting stuff. We really are all connected. So looking at the hips too, injuries should not be viewed as just an isolated joint issue because of what I just said. We really are all connected. Weakness is going to occur in the entire kinetic chain. So this kind of goes, there's some articles that you might want to look up on your own. I'll give you the information here. Friel, F-R-I-E-L, was the lead researcher on the influence of ankle sprain injuries of muscle activation during hip extension. The influence of ankle sprain injuries of muscle activation during hip extension. And basically what he found is ipsilateral hip weakness after ankle sprains. So ipsilateral, same hip. So if your right ankle was sprained, you start to see right hip weakness. Bullock Saxton in 1994 had an article, Ankle Sprains influence glute muscle activation. Well, we've been talking about that. And what they found is that their method of their study was the authors were looking at the function of the hip and specifically hip extension after a severe ankle sprain. They had about 20 men who were between the ages of 18 and 35 who had suffered unilateral severe ankle sprains no less than 4 months earlier, who were pain-free at the time of the study, and they compared them to 11 matched controls. The muscle activation during prone hip extension was measured using electromyography on the motor points of the ipsilateral and contralateral lumbar spine extensors, along with the hamstrings and the gluteus maximus of both lower limbs. So what the results were that comparison revealed that for the control group, the pattern of activation was consistent between sides of the body, and the timing of muscle activation on each of the 4 monitored muscles was also simultaneously. Great and wonderful, right? In contrast, for the experimental group that had the ankle injury, it basically showed little consistency within the subjects between sides. And while there was a greater spread in timing of the muscle activation in both the injured and the uninjured limb, particularly contributed to by the more marked delay in activation of the glute max. So what they were finding was the ankle that was sprained, if it was the right ankle, that glute max wasn't as quick and good and strong at being activated when it needed to be. So the implications, looking at, for those of you PTs, athletic trainers, looking at other symptoms from an ankle sprain. We tend to focus so much on the ankle joint, we need to look higher up is basically what they're talking about. So we do need to emphasize a broader range of client assessment with treatment directed at improving appropriate muscle activation. So we do need to look at those glutes. You got somebody coming to you with chronic ankle sprains, or they just had a very severe ankle sprain and they need rehabilitation for it, got to look at the glutes as well. Now, the Friel study found that hip abductor muscle strength and plantar flexion were significantly less on the involved side of an ankle injury than the uninvolved side. So again, it's just kind of emphasizing what we're saying. It's not just about the ankle. It's not just about the ankle injury. It's going to affect other things further up the kinetic chain. So when we're looking at helping our clients rehabilitate, we got to look at that whole lower body and see what's going on. So losing ankle mobility. Limited dorsiflexion affects normal movement. Common reasons, previous injury, your footwear that you're wearing, too far forward center of gravity, never using full range of motion during movement, and then, of course, lack of movement. So lack of ankle mobility has become more and more common. This is likely from a variety of causes, but the most common include the ones that we were just looking at. So previous injury, especially when mobility was lost and never restored. Ask your client how many have sprained their ankle. Ask how many have had to immobilize it through wraps and bandages and never did therapy for it afterwards. Some people self-treat, and that's not always a good thing because they're thinking, oh, let's make this feel better. But because they're lay people who are not in this field, once it's better, they think they're done. And it's like, no, they don't understand the need for strength and flexibility after an injury. And what can happen is scar tissue might develop, and that may permanently limit their range of motion forever and ever. We don't want that to happen. Modern footwear, like we said, also is a heavy influence, not just of our feet and ankles, but also posture muscles. And like we mentioned earlier, your high tops, high heels, shoes with very rigid lateral movement, sandals, they all affect biomechanics of the joint because things aren't moving the way they want to naturally. And because of the postural distortions that happen, you get the forward head, the anterior pelvic tilt, then we tend to carry our center of gravity too far forward, and that starts to affect the ankle joint as well as things further up the chain. It's rare that full dorsiflexion is used in daily activity, yet it's needed to perform some of our fundamental movements. So due to a lack of movement and improper footwear, intrinsic muscles of the feet start to atrophy and weaken. Because of this, the larger muscles, such as the gastroc, the soleus, the anterior tib, they all start to stiffen up and start to compensate. And with these when these muscles tighten, mobility at the joint is lost, and just stretching these alone is not going to help you completely restore mobility, which is our next slide. Look at that. So static stretching alone, and I think we all probably are familiar with this, especially as we're seeing more and more articles on myofascial release. We need to combine it. We've got some deep fascia that static stretching, dynamic stretching, it's not going to reach that. We've got to get into the deeper fascia. However, and this is not covered in this presentation so much, but you've got to get properly trained on the self-myofascial release. I think we have all seen some very strange things happen when we see people who are not properly trained in myofascial release, foam rolling, that kind of thing. And the fact that people can buy this now at any sporting goods store, they think they know how to do it. And it goes back into making sure that you are releasing what needs to be released at that point in time. There is a time and a place to do foam rolling and all the variety of different methods on certain muscles. There is a format, so to speak, or an order that needs to occur, and people don't always understand that order. Because remember, tight muscles can get trigger points, stretched and weak muscles can get trigger points. And you don't always need to be foam rolling the stretched and weak muscles right off the bat. So if you aren't properly trained in self-myofascial release, please, please, please do not do it on your client or teach your client. Actually, you can't do it on your client unless you're an athletic trainer, physical therapist, or a licensed massage therapist. But before you try to show your client how to do it, you need to make sure that you're trained, because if you do it wrong, you can harm your client more so than help them. If you do know how to do it, that was my little disclaimer, spend at least 5 minutes per joint before you can see improvement. And explain to your clients that it's not going to feel good. This is not a feel-good kind of thing. It's not a massage. It's not, you're trying to reduce and release trigger points, and it's going to, be very tender initially. So keep that in mind. But a combination of the two is really better than just one or the other. And then as far as improving your foot range of motion, the foot having the proper movement capability is obviously very important for human movement. So the foot is loaded with those proprioceptors, the Golgi tendons, the muscle spindles. So if they are to work properly, the joints have to be able to move as they provide feedback to the nervous system. If they cannot, more traditional balance training will likely be ineffective. Think about that. Yeah, we're always working on balance training, but if there is a range of motion issue going on, all the balance training in the world is not going to help. So rolling the feet with a tennis ball or a lacrosse ball is a great way to restore movement if that is the issue and the dorsal part of the foot, which, yes, most of the time it is, but make sure you do those assessments first that we talked about earlier. You can also do a self-foot massage. I know, it's not the same as when somebody else massages your foot, but it's better than nothing. And what you can do is just grab the midfoot of the midfoot and move it back and forth like you were trying to rip a phone book. And this helps to gently create some movement in the joints of the feet, especially those metatarsals. Barefoot activities or walking on uneven surfaces is good. Simple practice, just basically to improve mobility. So one of the challenges, especially with your older adults, is they always want to wear their shoes. Now, we're not saying exercise barefoot, the barefoot shoes I know we were talking about earlier, because we do need some cushioning and padding as we do high impact or heavy impact type activities. But it is okay to go barefoot every once in a while. And it's very helpful to go barefoot every once in a while. So that's something that you might want to encourage your clients. Use it or lose it, right? And then stretching the feet. Nice stretches here, stretching the toes, working on the extension of the toes. This picture on the left, here's another good picture. If your client can't do this knee position for whatever reason, just have them start standing, because sometimes people can't get into this position because they're lacking this dorsiflexion of the ankle. So, and they're trying to work on it by starting with the toes. So just have them stand and work on stretching the toes and see if that helps. Or they may need to place a pad or pillow behind the knees, but starting in the standing position might be ideal. Strengthening the toes. Can you do these pictures? That's a challenge. Most people can do this one on the right, but they have trouble with this one. So starting with all toes in extension, then try to touch only the big toe to the ground, and then repeat with only the toes. So just like in the picture here. And then do the same drill, keeping the lateral toes on the floor and only lifting the big toe. So a lot of people will find that this picture here on the left is probably pretty challenging because it's not something we always do, but this will help strengthen those extensors. And medial lower leg releases. Again, make sure you know how to do this properly and you know when to do this. But these are methods that will help with that fascial release. So you can take a tennis ball or that lacrosse ball and roll up and down the medial aspect of the lower leg. You can add some movement of the foot, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion while you're rolling. That also helps to kind of release the muscles a little bit more. And it's a great release for the posterior tibialis, which is kind of deep. Your flexor digitorum longus of the toes. Anytime you see digitorum, that's dealing with the toes, or if you're looking at the hands, it's the fingers. The flexor muscle, this is one that is on the bottom of the foot and comes up along the medial side of the lower leg, so it flexes the toes or curls the toes. And that little forgotten, tiny little plantaris muscle. And I say tiny just because it's very narrow. It's a long muscle, but it's very narrow. And very forgotten because it's kind of a weak muscle. It's always going to be a synergist in movements, but still got to work those synergist muscles. Oh, and it also gets the flexor hallucis longus. That wasn't mentioned in here. Remember, hallucis is the big toe. So this is the muscle that flexes the big toe. Getting your lateral lower leg releases. Release for the anterior tibialis, the peroneals or the fibularis muscles, the extensor digitorum and extensor hallucis longus muscles helps relieve some of the tightness in those areas. And, you know, again, in this picture, they're using a different type of roller here than, one of these other pictures, which I will go back to later. The type of foam roller that you use is also important too. So again, another good reason to kind of get into one of those self-myofascial release courses so you can learn more about that, make sure you're doing it properly. So great techniques to use. One of the challenges, however, of doing your foam rolling this way is now you're having, of course, to use your hand to apply some of the pressure. And that's not always ideal sometimes in foam rolling. So it's maybe a good way to start if your muscles are very, very tender. But putting some body weight on it or some pressure outside of your hand might be better. And sometimes when people see the handheld, trainers often think that they can do this on their client. And please realize that personal trainers are not within the scope of practice of being able to do myofascial release of any kind even if it's with a tennis ball, foam roller, whatever, you cannot do this on your client because that gets into the licensure issue of massage therapy and athletic training and physical therapy as far as being able to touch the client and be able to manipulate muscles. So I see trainers doing this all the time, and you're out of your scope of practice if you are doing it. So that's why we really emphasize self-myofascial release. Your client does it on themselves, and you are teaching them how to do it properly, but you cannot do myofascial release on your client if you are not a PT, an ATC, or a licensed massage therapist. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. And then plantar flexion stretch. Now, sometimes people will say, well, I can't do this because of my knees. Well, again, it may be your knee issue, might be your ankle issue. So you may need to modify this a little bit. But if your client is able to do this, you want to keep the heels together. Sit on a pad if full knee flexion cannot be tolerated, but don't put the pad behind the knee because then that puts a lot of pressure on the knee ligaments. Put the pad underneath the glutes. And perform standing variations when clients cannot kneel. So, you know, what I think about when I see this is when I see gymnasts get ready to do their little routines and they are standing and flexing their toes and kind of leaning in on the toes and you know, and granted this isn't just for the toes, but it's also for the ankle. You know, you can modify it in the standing position or even in the seated position for your client to help plantar flex the ankle and also flex the toes if that's what they are needing. And then your standing wall calf mobilization exercise. And this is kind of a take on the one where you lean against the wall. This one might be a little bit better because they can kind of control the movement a little bit more so and get those toes in there. So you've got your straight-legged version, of course, which is these first couple of pictures here. To get the gastrocnemius. Remember, we got to keep the knee straight to get the gastrocnemius because that gastrocnemius crosses the knee joint and assists in knee flexion. And remember, in order to stretch a muscle, you got to do the opposite of its action. So we got to keep the knee straight. And the key here is to dorsiflex. So you can stretch those muscles. Now, here, what they're doing is they're leaning back a little away. That's good to do if your client is very limited in this range of motion. But what you eventually would like to be able to do is to pull the body in towards the pole or wall or whatever you're using so that the body is straight and you're really getting good dorsiflexion there with that ankle. You also do it with the bent knee position because now, because the soleus does not cross the knee joint, it only does ankle dorsiflexion or plantar flexion. So you're stretching it with ankle dorsiflexion. Now you're focusing more on stretching the soleus in this last picture rather than the gastrocnemius. Also notice too, she's kind of got her foot slid down a little bit closer to the floor in this picture. Mainly, you know, partly because she is bending the knee a little bit, but that also gets those toes stretched. So it stretches those toe flexors. Great little stretch to do. So you could do these outside on a curb if your person has good balance and doesn't need the pole. But again, the key is to try to keep the body upright and not lean the glutes out so that you get that good range of motion. And then rocking ankle motion. You see this a lot like in yoga classes, the down dog. I'm not a yoga instructor, so hopefully that's the one. But this is great to help work on strengthening of your muscles. So, of course, here working on gastrocnemius and soleus, but more so gastroc because the knee is straight. Just going up into plantar flexion of the ankle. You can also do it with the knee bent in order to help strengthen that soleus muscle if there's weakness in those areas. And then just the lifting and the lowering, not just an exercise, but also helps work on as you lower that ankle dorsiflexion. One other little advantage to this is this other leg right up here, let me go with this picture, is because of the position of the foot of the non-exercising leg, you are getting a little stretching there for the toes. So, you know, all around good way to help work on some mobility and strength. And then with your inversion and eversion stretching, just sitting in a chair, any client could do this, and just kind of maneuver the ankle into not the pronation, which is the combination of movements in two different planes of motion. So you got plantar flexion and inversion and dorsiflexion and eversion. We're just looking at eversion and inversion. And sometimes people say, well, wait a minute, I'm always spraining my ankle and it's always a lateral ankle sprain. So why would I want to work on this stretching? Okay, well, maybe not so much on the lateral side, maybe more so on the medial side. But again, if your client has had previous ankle sprains, they may have some scar tissue in there. And if it's a fairly new injury and they are ready to do some mobility, then that may help prevent the scar tissue from laying down and being permanent and permanently affecting their range of motion. So if your client or you, if you're not a PT, ATC, massage therapist, you might want to double check with your client and with their doctor or whoever maybe treated them, the PT, the athletic trainer, to make sure that mobility and strengthening needs to be focused on at this point in time. Of course, we never want to do anything with an acute injury, and that really kind of should have been stated at the beginning of this thing. These are your chronic ones. What we're talking about in this program is dealing with chronic injuries, not your acute injuries. Of course, your acute injuries need to have some time to heal. There is a time and a place for movement and strengthening, and that's why it's very important, although most of us don't do this, is to get it checked, especially if it's a bad sprain, get it checked to make sure that it is appropriate for some mobility and some strengthening. Make sure it's healed up. So it's always good, you know, that when in doubt, refer it out kind of thing. And then some three-dimensional calf stretching. Your Achilles tendon kind of fans out a little bit. We know the gastrocnemius fans out. Your soleus kind of fans out. So it's good to make sure that we're getting all kinds of planes of motion involved as far as stretching and strengthening. So leaning in different directions, taking the wall stretch for the calf muscle. Now we're working on this back leg in all three of these pictures, but all we're doing is kind of shifting the, oops, I forget that this thing moves. We're shifting the weight focus lateral. We're shifting it into neutral in this picture, and then we're shifting it crossover in this last picture to make sure that we're getting all the different fans of the fibers to get good stretching. So that's important too. You can't just, if you've got any muscle, you know, this is true with the pecs or, you know, any muscle that fans out where the fibers go in different directions, you need to work your range of motion in those different directions, but you also need to make sure you're working your stretching in all of those different directions so that you ensure that you're stretching or strengthening all the muscle fibers and not just a select few. So this is another great stretch that you can do. And then your ankle, your active ankle dorsiflexion drill. Well, the assessment that we were doing earlier makes a great exercise to keep working on that range of motion. So you perform that half kneeling dorsiflexion stretch, and when you reach your end range, just rock back and forth, but try to maintain the same degree of dorsiflexion, or, you know, if you're trying to improve your dorsiflexion. Now, I wonder how many of you were like, oh, wait a minute, you know, knees going beyond the toes here. This is for a stretch. This is not for a lunge or a squat to help work the quads and the glutes and that kind of thing. This is to help work on some range of motion exercises. So it's not that you're adding weight. You don't want to add weight to this. This is a range of motion exercise, not a strengthening exercise. So having your knee go a little bit forward in front of your toes in this particular situation is okay to do because you're trying to increase that range of motion of the ankle. And That's what you have to do sometimes in order to increase it. So make sure you are keeping the toes about 5 inches, maybe less initially if your person is limited in that range of motion. But don't go beyond 5 inches because now you are putting way too much stress and stretch on your ankle and a lot of pressure on your knee joint. So it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier. Too much is not a good thing, but too little is not a good thing either. We need to find that happy medium. So having your toes about 5 inches from the wall, no more, is that point. So just a nice, gentle, kind of a dynamic movement, leaning back and forth to help work on that range of motion. And then addressing ankle sprains. In 2002, there was a study done by Blackburn and his associates, and it demonstrated that after just 7 days of integrated intrinsic foot strengthening, basically short foot, gluteus medius activation increased 200%. That's a lot. So this could further support that association between deep foot activation and proximal stability and ankle stability, and basically the kinetic chain that we're talking about. So what you can do, test single leg stance, or we call it a stork stance sometimes. So that's the picture of this person in this picture that she's doing her little stork stance. Some of you might know this as a yoga pose where they slide the leg up even further. But for this purpose, you just have your foot just below the knee on the medial side. And restore that loss of ankle range of motion. Just have them stand there and see if they can do this. Multi-planar strengthening exercises, which we're going to get into some of these in other slides. And like the study said, you improve your glute strength, which, like we mentioned, is a part of that kinetic chain that is affected, that creates this vicious cycle of not walking or running properly. And that affects your squats, your lunges, and your daily activities where you do these types of things. So if you ever have a client who, and this kind of gets into some of your different assessments that you can do on your client. So if you're familiar in FMS or some of these other types of assessment techniques, you're familiar with this already. You got the client who leans too far forward as they're doing a squat. They're really flexing at the hip. Chances are they may be compensating for lack of ankle range of motion, because if you can't dorsiflex your ankle, but you still need to squat down, you don't want to put all that pressure on your knee, so they flex more at the hip. And that typically means that every time they do their squats, they're not engaging their glutes. So lots of pressure on the quads, not a whole lot of good stress on the glutes. And the glutes keep getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And again, it creates this vicious cycle. So we do need to look at the whole body. And we do need to look at that kinetic chain. And we do need to start thinking, if you aren't already, what's going on at the bottom of the kinetic chain, which is your foundation, which is going to be your ankle. So improving ankle and foot stabilization, some exercises that can help with this. You need both mechanical joint stability and neuromuscular control. You can't have one without the other. So the first thing we need to do is get proper alignment with mobility, and then neuromuscular control to provide stability. So get the alignment, get the mobility, then you can get the neuromuscular control that's going to help with the stability. So as you're doing these exercises, so for example, she's got her anchor of her band over here. So she's got the band wrapped around the leg that's furthest from the ankle, from the anchor. Talking about the ankles, and I'm getting my words confused here. And proper alignment of the body, nice and straight. Look for collapsing arches. That's something you want to watch for. Make sure that they've got their arch support, because if their arch is collapsing, guess what that knee is going to do? It's going to start angling this way, and that's not going to be proper alignment. So, let me clear this here. There we go. So we need to make sure that the arch is up, it's supported, and that the body's properly aligned. And use the band to help resist because it's trying to pull your knee in this angle and you are resisting it this way to help keep the body aligned, in the process helping to keep the ankle stable. So that's one exercise that you can have your client do. And just have your client maybe start off holding it for about 10 seconds and building up to maybe 30 seconds. Barefoot warm-ups. Remember we said that being barefoot periodically is a good thing because it helps to get those proprioceptors, the sensory nerves in the foot, to kind of go, oh, hey, this is what we used to do. We need to re-educate ourselves a little bit so that we can send this information up to the spinal cord and the brain so that the brain can send information about foot placement on uneven surfaces back to the Golgi tendons and the muscle spindles. Okay, so start the workout with low intensity barefoot exercises. Do some toe heel walking. Do the tiptoe farmer's walk. And what that is what this picture is talking about. You're probably familiar with the farmer's walk where you have a weight or a kettlebell on one side only and you're keeping the body in alignment instead of leaning towards the weight. So you're keeping the body in good alignment, but now you're walking on your toes. Do some light running. Do some skipping, do some balancing exercises barefoot, just to kind of get those sensory nerves to kind of awaken a little bit. Do some isometric foot supination. Of course, isometric means there is no movement at the joint. It's static. It's stabilizing. Make sure as they do this that they can maintain the arch of their foot with resistance. So you just have them with a band around the ankles, have the feet about a little wider than shoulder or hip width, or have it about shoulder width. Get them into a good squat position. Watch the knee alignment. Watch the back. Again, all of this is hinging on good range of motion of the ankle, which is what we're kind of working on with here. And have them just stand this way first. Now notice he doesn't have his shoes on. So have them just stand this way. Notice that they've got the arch up high. You can kind of see how the toes are a little lifted right here to make sure that they have good arch support, because again, that natural arch is good. You want to watch for that. And you're thinking, well, how can I tell? Well, one of the little simple easy things that you could do is if you take your index finger, you should be able to slide it under your client's arch at the apex of the arch and get up to that first digit of your index finger underneath the foot. And if they are unable to do that, they may say something like, well, I have arch supports in my shoes. Well, maybe they don't need the arch supports in their shoes. And we don't want them to use the arch supports in their shoes right now. We want to work on those deep intrinsic muscles to help get some stability going again and get some range of motion going again. So, but in this case, we're looking at stability. So get them to shift their weight a little bit more to the lateral side of their foot to help raise that arch up so that you can get that first phalange, that first joint of your finger underneath their foot. And that makes sure that they have that good arch support. Have them hold that position while they're standing and just hold that position 10, 20, 30 seconds. Some of your clients who depend on those arch supports may only be able to hold it for 10 seconds before other muscles in their legs start to fatigue. But form is the key here. Then once they are able to maintain their arch with just static resistant standing, start to add some squats to increase the challenge, which is what he's doing in the second picture. But again, make sure that they are able to maintain that arch. That is really key to the point. So that's a really, really good exercise. And then some barefoot balance walks. You know, some people feel that they have to wear their shoes because they don't have good balance unless they're wearing their shoes. Well, that's telling you they got some issues going on there. So just a line that you create. Sometimes I use painter's tape for this because it doesn't leave sticky residue on your floor. And it's not that expensive. But just have them do some barefoot walking. Lifting the knee up high like he's doing in this picture if you want to, or just regular walking, one foot in front of the other. and make sure that they can stay on the line. That will also help work those intrinsic muscles, those Golgi tendons, the muscle spindles, those proprioceptors in the foot. Band hurdle steps. Very similar to the other exercise that we were doing earlier, where you have the anchor for on one side, and you have the band wrapped just below the knee in a comfortable position around the calf muscle of the leg furthest away from the anchor. Now, again, make sure they can maintain their arch support on this. If they can't, then you don't need to add this particular movement just yet. If they can maintain that good arch, now what you're going to have your client do is, while they're maintaining the arch in their foot and good posture position, now they're going to take the leg that's closest to the anchor that doesn't have the band wrapped around it, and they're going to bring the leg up and over the band and then back behind the band, and just have them repeat that for however many repetitions that you want them to do, 10, 15, something like that. But again, make sure that throughout the entire range of motion on this exercise that they are maintaining their posture, their knee isn't starting to collapse into that valgus position, and they're maintaining that arch support. Okay, and offer them cues. If they goof up once, offer them the cues, let them stop and reposition themselves and start again. But if they keep losing that form, that tells you that's probably their last repetition there, because form is key. And then your anterior reach. This is great to use for ankle range of motion. Helps to work on posture and core and engage those glute muscles. It's kind of similar to the golf reach and kettlebell type exercises. So you're using a contralateral reach. It can use whatever you want to use to help them tap the finger. Watch for and maintain neutral arch. Again, that is so important on all of these exercises, because otherwise you're wasting your time doing these exercises because you're training your muscles in a bad position. So watch for that arch. Add a band or unstable surface for higher levels of challenges. You can add the Dynadisc to help really incorporate those proprioceptors. But make sure, too, that other things are in alignment. So keep the spine in good alignment. Let that back leg kick up. And overall proper form on this one. So lots of things that you, the trainer, need to look for as your client's doing these exercises. Again, if they start to lose their form, have them stop, have them readjust, see if they can get back into good form again. If not, that may have been their last repetition. But form is key. And then your single foot rotational reaches. Again, back in my day, I graduated a long time ago from school back in the 80s, and we just didn't really understand the need to work in multi-planar type motions unless you're an athlete. So important, because I think a lot of people from that generation are really kind of lacking in that now because we didn't know to do it back then. So great exercise for all of your populations if it's safe for them to do it. So basically the goal is to reach as far as possible out to the side, like in this first picture, and behind you, and that's the key there, as far as possible as you can without losing your foot, ankle, or knee alignment on the stance foot. So he's got his shoes on here. You can also do this one barefoot, where you can really watch for the arch and make sure everything's good. But if they've got their shoes on here, remember, if the knees are starting to go valgus, especially on this one, that tells you that they're losing their arch. So really watch the knees here. Really watch the position of the entire body, the trunk, everything, and see how far they can reach over, and just have them repeat this. You can make it even more challenging, which he's doing in this picture. It may have just been the timing of the picture, but you can initially have them touching the floor, but they don't really want to put a whole lot of weight on it. And as they get more advanced, they can do the movements without touching the floor. And again, making sure that they're maintaining that alignment. And then your single leg medicine ball throws. This is where you can have your client facing sideways against the wall, as in this first picture right here, and maintain, look at those muscles. Wow, look at that vastus medialis there. But maintaining that knee alignment, maintaining the foot arch, get into that good position. So this is going to be a very advanced exercise. Have your client maintain this nice, solid alignment here that's going on. Raise the other leg that's closest to the wall and toss the medicine ball up against the wall and catch it. Toss and catch while maintaining that ankle. So you're getting really into a lot of 3D type movements here and some coordination with catching the ball. Not so much standing, but catching the ball for me. I don't know about you. And then, of course, you can do the same thing facing forward. Real good arch position here. Notice the toes. That's helping to strengthen and stabilize those toe flexors there. So that's why it's also very important to have those stretches afterwards. Maintaining good, proper alignment here. And now you're throwing the ball forward while you've got the leg up. This works on that ankle stability. It works on what needs to be as far as statically maintaining the ankle. A whole slew of big things. So this is a very good dynamic type exercise with some stability and isometric type exercises included in it. So great one to do. But again, remember, it's a very advanced exercise. And then your single leg hops. This is another progression for another very advanced exercise. Can your client, once they're able to stably stand, that's a word, and maintain that arch position and the ankle stability with the good arch position, now let's add some dynamic movements to it because the body does move throughout the day. So now we're starting to do hops from one leg to the other, or you can do all on one leg, however you want to do it. But what you're looking for is they can maintain that arch and maintain their good body position. So start with jumping off on one foot and landing on the other. The goal is to stick the landing and show proper foot ankle stability. Again, looking at the arches, but also the ankle stability. And then as they got that down, then you can start to incorporate multiple planes of motion, having them hop in different directions, different angles, you know, however you want to do that in order to really progress this person to make sure that they've got that good stability for their ankle and good movement and range of motion. So putting it all together, remember we work on the ankle to improve functional movement. So make sure to do your pre and post exercise assessments. It may be good to do the assessments that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. Do those again, maybe 6 to 12 weeks or every 6 to 12 weeks to make sure that your client is making good progress. Everybody progresses differently, but you do want to make sure that what you're doing is heading your client in the right direction. And by doing these reassessments, if they're not, then you need to go back and reevaluate what's going on. Maybe you've progressed the client too fast. Maybe they're not doing everything that they need to do on their own, which is a common issue. You know, sometimes our clients depend on us to do everything or to, you know, oversee everything, but they've got homework too, so to speak. So that may be an issue. So the assessments and the reassessments are very, very beneficial. And that's where using your goniometers can really give you some good information because it gives you some real good numbers. It's not always easy to eyeball. So consider that as well. And then look at the squats, look at the lunges, look at the step-ups, the deadlifts. What is their form doing? Is their form getting better? And if it is, great. Is their knee problem that maybe they had a knee problem? Is that getting better? Great. Hip, back, whatever's going on. If all of that is getting better, your client is heading in a good right direction. And also, do you see improvement? I think it's always important for us, you know, chances are when you're seeing your clients, they're back to back. But sometimes it's nice to be able to see your client as they're coming into your facility, as they're leaving your facility, when they don't realize that you are watching them. And that way you can get some really good assessments on your client, because we all know that when you are looking at your client and they know you're looking at them, things change and all of a sudden things are perfect and you're like, well, I don't understand what's going on with my client. So observe your client when they don't realize that you're watching them, and see if you're seeing some improvements. You got all kinds of apps on your phone that you can get for free, this, that, the other thing. Sometimes videoing your client, if they're okay with it, that you can really see these changes. And you can look back at your original videos, your original assessments, and it's just amazing sometimes what your client maybe doesn't think they're improving, but you're able to show them that they are, either through the videos, through the goniometer measurements, you know, anything that can be helpful to show your client that they are improving. This particular picture right here, you know, I always looked at different cultures that would sit like this. And I'm like, I mean, even their seniors, you know, their 70, 80, 90-year-old elders would sit in this position. And I'm like, how in the heck can they do that? And I realized they got good ankle mobility, and I don't. And this is an area that needs to be worked on. So, and people say, oh, but this is such a bad position for your knees. Well, it is if you don't have good ankle mobility. So just a food for thought. So you have finished your webinar. Yay. So as promised, and again, you may have already printed this out, you can get your certificate immediately. In fact, we encourage that you do that. So just go to the exerciseetc.com website and click on the administration button. And once you click on that, look for the Webinar on Demand Certificates link. And you're going to complete all the required fields. And just as an FYI, make sure you complete the fields the way that your certifying organization has your name, just to make sure that they can find you easily. And your certificate will appear on the screen, and if you like it the way it is, go ahead and print it off. And of course, if you're not near a printer, just save it so you can print it off later. And again, remember this last point down here: if you fast forwarded or went through the program faster than I did, then you may not get your continuing education credits. And this program, however it does it, it tracks it. So hopefully nobody did that. And again, just remember to complete this webinar, print your certificate by December 31st of the same year that you purchased it, because certificates with next year's date may not be accepted by your organization. And we don't want that to happen to you. So thank you for listening, and hope to talk to you in a future webinar.